Well, Krish, this will have come as a shock to former colleagues here at the BBC, as well as many viewers around the country, given Huw Edwards' very high public profile, his status within the industry, within this institution. But worth remembering as well that he hasn't actually been on air for more than a year now, since he was suspended by the BBC last summer.
Tonight at 10, one of the biggest...
For 20 years as the main presenter of News at 10, Huw Edwards was the leading face and voice of BBC News. He led coverage of major national moments, earning widespread praise for his handling of the death of the Queen.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
But in July last year, allegations emerged in the Sun newspaper about the private life of one of the BBC's household names. After days of frenzied speculation, Mr. Edwards' wife announced that he was indeed the person in question. He was suspended from his role and underwent inpatient mental health care as the BBC carried out an internal investigation. Last week it was announced that he'd been awarded a £40,000 pay rise last year, bringing his salary to at least £475,000. In April this year, Mr. Edwards resigned from the BBC on medical advice. Well, the Metropolitan Police essentially confirming that these allegations had been under investigation since at least November last year, because they say that is when he was arrested and then charged last month with 3 counts of making indecent images of children. A spokesperson for the Met saying that the offences, which are alleged to have taken place between December 2020 and April 2022, relate to images shared on a WhatsApp chat. No further detail than that being released, but it's worth noting that the Crown Prosecution Service, in its legal guidance on this offence, does give a fairly broad range of activity, from opening an email attachment containing such an image to downloading one from a website to storing them on a device, live streaming such images, and indeed receiving images of this nature on social media. So to recap then, the Metropolitan Police confirming that Huw Edwards was charged on the 26th of June with 3 counts of making indecent images of children, and that he was bailed and will appear before Westminster magistrates this week, Wednesday, the 31st of July.
Harry Fawcett.
Now the BBC News with Huw Edwards. It's 6 o'clock.
America is pounded by the biggest wave of terrorist attacks ever seen. It's time for Britain to leave the European Union. Every part of the United Kingdom is now in lockdown.
I saw his rapid rise to a very important figure at BBC Television News.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Make way! Make way!
What Huw Edwards did damaged the reputation and the trust for the BBC.
Former BBC News presenter Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty of making indecent images of children.
He was this figure who did the most appalling things.
The BBC did what it always does and blames the press. It hates the Sun.
My God, look at the damage to the BBC.
One of Britain's best-known TV newsmen is dominating headlines across the pond.
The pressure we were under was immense, but we never had any doubt that we would be proved right.
It's a colossal fall from grace from somebody who was widely respected.
On behalf of BBC, thank you all very much.
This was the small cloud that was going to turn into a Force 10 gale.
Everyone in this building knows who it is.
Nobody at the BBC seemed to react.
You should know that I am programmed by the BBC to tell the truth.
Family wanted to release him from his toxic relationship with Huw Edwards.
I knew what his modus operandi was, but I didn't know it was that bad.
I knew he was an abuser. Now the whole world can see the kind of man he is. When I first saw the messages, I felt physically sick to my stomach. There were so many. On New Year's Eve, even when Huw was with his family. Calling my son a good boy. Sending him kisses and love hearts. And money. Even telling him he loves him. But then others, more aggressive. Calling my son all sorts, threatening my boy. They even arranged to meet in person. My son told me everything. Huw Edwards had been paying him for sexual pictures. Huw Edwards was paying him to perform sexually. My son. We had to stop it. We had a completely normal life before all this. We were in a nice area when my son was growing up. We had family nearby. My son was a part of all that. We used to go out in the car, take the dog for a walk, just your typical family getting on with our lives. This is him. He was such a lovely boy. A lovable little boy. Bubbly. Everyone loved him. He loved telling jokes. He was a comedian. Every kid loved him in the school. All his teachers loved him. He was top of the class in everything. The head of his school was speaking to other schools about him because he was that intelligent. Every subject was A's and B's. His favourite subject was maths, and he loved reading. Even the newspapers. He loved stories about money. We joked that one day he might end up working in the city. He wanted to be a lawyer. That was his aim.
But within a few months of leaving school, Neil fell in with the wrong crowd, leading to problems with drug abuse.
It was like he had a twin. He would walk out and then he would walk back in like he was a different person.
He came in one day, he never had no money, he never had nothing. And the next thing he knows, he's got money. He's gone into town, he's bought a t-shirt, hasn't he? He's got a t-shirt, he's bought shorts, he bought tracksuit bottoms, he bought trainers, took his cousin out for food, stayed out all night. Only way he was like that is because he was given money the night before to go out. The partying.
Suddenly out of nowhere, he had money to spend. He started showing me deposits in his bank account for £2,000 at a time. I asked his cousin who was paying him, and they said it was an old man with grey hair. I couldn't believe it. A grey-haired man was sending money to my 17-year-old son. I felt sick. I knew it must be something sexual, but I didn't even realise he was gay at this point. He didn't come out to me until later.
The grey-haired man turned out to be one of the BBC's biggest stars, Huw Edwards.
He said it was Huw, and we didn't believe him. I didn't believe him. There needed to be an explanation where all the money was coming from, because I would say all the time, what's going on? Where's this money coming from? I believed he was getting money from somewhere, but I just didn't believe that it would be the BBC News reader. He's actually rang Huw while Huw's been on the TV to prove a point to us. And the phone is in his pocket. You saw this Huw going like, what? You could see the reaction on his face.
One day he got his phone up and said, look mum. He was using one hand to scroll through the phone with the screen facing me. He scrolled for ages. Then I saw Huw Edwards' name over and over again. There were huge sums, thousands of pounds at a time. 5,000 in one lump sum. He was like, Mum, you'll never guess how much I had off Huw. He was proud of it, smiling. He told me all in he had £35,000, and that money was in exchange of sexually explicit photographs. Huw Edwards would send my son selfies. One time he sent a photo of his desk at work in the BBC newsroom. He clearly didn't care. He sent me a picture of Huw Edwards sat on a sofa in his boxers, leaning forward as though getting ready to fondle himself while my son performs for him. They would have sex on a video call and Edwards would pay him for it. Huw Edwards was a man in his 60s and my son was a teenage boy. It wasn't normal. I didn't like that he was telling or showing me. Of course I didn't. I was worried out of my mind. but as his mother, I didn't want him to stop confiding in me. I liked that man. He was always my favourite on TV. My favourite. He was Welsh, like us. And then sometimes I could hear my son on the phone to him, and I could hear an evil man talking. The next day, I would see him presenting the news on TV, and I'd see evil.
Huw Edwards was the face of the BBC.
Very warm welcome to BBC News at 10.
It's impossible to exaggerate the importance of Huw Edwards to the BBC. He was, for many people, the BBC. He wasn't just the main newsreader of the main bulletin. He was selected to front the major state occasions, the great occasions in this country, the important things that happen.
Look at this. It's a pretty wonderful view. Good morning, everyone. Of course, this is one of the most iconic views in the world. A wave of cheers and encouragement from outside in the lower ward of the castle.
He presented some real appointment to view pieces, such as the coronation of King Charles.
You will be placing that crown on the King's head.
I will.
And you have to do it with great care.
I have to do it with great care.
The Queen's funeral.
An experience that we will never forget.
He was involved in election coverage.
Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority.
So for the BBC, Huw was a very well paid, very highly trusted, major public figure.
So now seems a very good moment to ask the question, who do we think we are?
A working-class boy from Bridgend in Wales, over a 39-year career, Huw Edwards rose through the ranks at the BBC to become one of the corporation's highest profile and highest paid presenters.
Huw, was it the truth or was it a lie?
You should know that I am programmed by the BBC to tell the truth.
The primetime cover star who in recent years built up a big following on social media.
I'm going to take you into the most secret place of all, which is our commentary box. Come and have a look.
I joined the BBC at about the same time as Huw Edwards in the late 1980s, so I knew Huw most when I was a duty editor on the Today programme. Quite a larger-than-life presence in the Today programme office and in the green room, and I think also ambitious.
And Huw Edwards presented 10 o'clock news, 10 years, I think, Huw?
That's a decade.
Married with 5 children, Edwards was also known to be a religious man.
Chapel-going, Christian, well advertised the fact that he was, played the organ and took part in all sorts of prestigious undertakings in Wales and elsewhere.
But former BBC colleagues say there was another, darker side to him.
About a year ago, somebody who was his boss and my boss said to me, "Can you tell me why Huw Edwards hates you so much?" And I thought, oh, I thought I was friends with him. So there's something very, very odd. He's not somebody who was liked very much. He was tricky to deal with, and you knew that if you spent time with him, he would slag off at least 10 other people. He was a bully, but he bullied upwards as well. I mean, I've never seen anyone so able to impose themselves on their own managers.
Several people have said this to me. They thought he was a bit odd, but they just put up with it. And I think the fact that he was as prominent as he was in the BBC enabled him to do and say things that perhaps others would not have got away with.
In May 2023, Anne learned Neil was planning to meet Huw Edwards at Cardiff train station.
His phone was broken, so my son used my phone to log into his social media account. I saw messages about half an hour later coming through from Huw Edwards. They were planning to meet at the train station. I just thought, this is it. This is our chance to stop this now.
I just said to my boss, I've got to go. I said, I've got a problem. I said, I've got to go over to the station. I've walked around. I've walked over to the entrance and there's Huw standing there looking around. He's just looking around. Basically, I wanted to grab hold of him. But that would have, obviously caused a lot of trouble. So I'm glad in hindsight, I'm glad it never happened. As I've managed to go towards him, he's gone through the turnstile to go up to the platform. So I've got down, but I've got up on the platform 3. I should have gone on the platform 1. And he was just standing on the platform just looking around. You could see he was just looking around waiting. That's when I decided, right, I took a video of him. I think it was only about 2 minutes, if that. I was just standing there. I'm the only person on platform 3. There's nobody else there. And I'm standing there like that with my phone, and I'm looking at him like that, straight at him. And he started looking around as if to say, oh well, is he doing that to me because I'm famous? But no, it was because he was supposed to be meeting our boy. And then that's when I went, well, actually I went back down, called him a name and went.
Immediately after leaving the station, David went straight to his local BBC office to make an official complaint about Huw Edwards, but he didn't get past security.
There were 2 older security guys. I was stopped in my tracks, so I explained I wanted to speak to a general manager, or someone in authority. And they wouldn't let me in the building. They said I was being aggressive and very volatile, which I suppose I was. I was determined that people coming out the lifts could hear what was going on, so I could get somebody's attention to come and see me.
The next day, David rang a BBC helpline to make his complaint.
I rang this number. It was false. It was a false number. The man actually gave me a false number. I had to Google Broadcasting House to get the right number. I rang the number, spoke to somebody on Your Say. I think the department is called Your Say. That's the first initial contact you have with the BBC. So I told them exactly what was going on. I asked them to just pass a message on to Huw Edwards to please stop giving our boy money, delete his number, and never have any more contact again with our boy. They'd gone to speak to somebody. They came back with some other questions, asking, have I got any proof of money being passed over, or have I got any evidence whatsoever? I just wanted it all to stop. I didn't want the drama. We didn't want all the drama. We just wanted it to stop. Wanted the money to stop. All the texting to stop. All contact. That was it. That's all we wanted.
But despite David's serious complaint to the BBC, Edwards was still in contact with Neil. And a month later, Edwards sent Neil another £1,000.
The boy was still having money. He was still coming in and saying, look Mum, Huw's giving me money today. Every time Huw gave him money, he told his mother.
Tonight at 10.
Over a month on from David's 29-minute phone call to the BBC in May, in June, Huw Edwards was still on air and even collected another accolade.
Thank you very much, dear friends. Thank you to Trick and thank you to the people who voted. On behalf of a huge team of people back at the BBC, thank you all very much. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
A prestigious Trick Award for the BBC's coverage of the Queen's funeral. Feeling ignored by the broadcaster, David rang the night news desk of the Sun newspaper.
First of all, we got a call from the parents of this young person telling us that their son had been receiving thousands and thousands of pounds from Huw Edwards in exchange for sexual pictures. They told us that they'd gone to the BBC already, they'd complained, BBC didn't do anything about it, and in fact it was so bad Mr. Edwards went on again to pay their son even some more money. And that really tipped them over the edge, and that's what made them ring the Sun. So I think it was a late night call that somebody on our news desk took, and we all considered the information in the morning. We'd been working on many Huw Edwards stories in the background over a number of years. We knew that the modus operandi he always had was to befriend somebody online, give them money, and then expect for pictures or sexual things in return. So it wasn't a surprise to us in many ways.
Investigative reporter Scarlett Howes was immediately assigned to the story.
You never know what to expect when you go and meet a person or a family when it comes to stories like this. But I was struck by how normal and kind-hearted and hard-working they were. They invited me into their smart terraced house. They sat me down. They were very worried because I had driven a long way from London to go and visit them. And, they instantly offered me a drink. They were worried that I was going to be thirsty or hungry. And, that kindness really shone through. And speaking to them, I saw how much love they had for their son, how much love they had for each other, and, what generous people they were. Well, as soon as I sat down with them, I knew that this ordinary, hard-working couple who clearly absolutely adored their son was going through terrible pain. They just needed help, and they needed somebody to listen to them and look after them, and they felt that the BBC had completely failed them.
It was about moral decisions. What he was doing was immoral. Like I keep saying, we never said it was illegal. We said it was immoral what he was doing. We wanted him out. How many more families? It had to be done. It had to be done regardless. We didn't want to hurt his family. We didn't want to hurt his wife or his children, but it had to come out.
The Sun had to decide whether to publish the parents' story and, crucially, whether to name Huw Edwards.
We had lots of stories about Huw from about 2018 onwards about his behaviour with young men. Some of them were very young, and each one we considered in its own merit. Was the public interest in doing this story? Obviously there were sensitivities because of the fact that it was with young boys or men, but on this particular story we felt it really stood out, because how can you have the most trusted person on the BBC, a 62-year-old man, sending thousands of pounds of cash to a strange young person he's met online? How can that ever be right?
Who is this? Top BBC star and sex pics probe.
Controversy over a well-known BBC presenter
has circled around the allegations over one young person.
The unnamed presenter in question has been suspended by the BBC.
The Sun's front page story immediately ignited a media storm, and a frenzied guessing game as to the identity of the unnamed BBC star broke out on social media, with a number of top-earning male presenters coming out publicly to deny it was them.
It was a distressing weekend. I can't deny it, for me and others falsely named.
He needs to come forward now, I think. I know his survival instinct has kicked in, and I know he saw what happened to Philip Schofield, but my God, look at the damage to the BBC. Look at the damage to his friends, to those falsely accused, and the longer he leaves it, the worse it will be for him.
Amid the growing furore, BBC Director General Tim Davie went on his own airwaves to address what was becoming a full-blown crisis for the corporation.
We're in a very strange situation, aren't we, in that he's not been named, but everyone in this building knows who it is. And there are an awful lot of people who you also have a duty of care to, male presenters on air, who are having to go on air to say that it's not them. It's not a sustainable situation, is it?
It is a very difficult and complex situation, and we're trying to calmly and judiciously navigate our way through quite difficult circumstances.
At 6, Huw Edwards is the presenter accused of paying a teenager for explicit photos.
5 days after The Sun first published Anne and David's story, the pressure got too much. Vicky Flynn, the wife of Huw Edwards, issued a statement naming her husband as the BBC presenter and announcing he was having mental health treatment.
He was suffering from serious mental health issues and is now receiving inpatient hospital care, where he will stay for the foreseeable future.
Meanwhile, The Sun and editor Vic Newton faced a backlash for publishing the parents' story, including from Edwards' friends and colleagues.
I think it would be a crying shame if this is the last we see of Huw Edwards on television, when the allegations have turned out to be not that much.
There was a huge attack on The Sun, and it was a fairly intolerable pressure. And the most shocking bit for me was when BBC News at 6 received a letter from the young person, from a lawyer representing the young person. They just whacked it on the airwaves in less than an hour without knowing the name of the young person. They didn't check the veracity of what he was saying. As I say, they didn't even know his name. I don't even know if they called the lawyer and got any information, but they just whacked something he said via a legal letter on air without knowing the background, without knowing what the evidence was. And I kind of think had The Sun done that, they'd have been coming down on us like a ton of bricks. But yeah, it felt like there was an orchestrated campaign by friends of Huw and some in the BBC. Not all of the BBC. I mean, some of the BBC did report itself on some people who'd complained also about Huw within their own organisation.
Caught in a very, very hard place, the BBC did what it always does and blames the press. And it couldn't have had a handier target than The Sun. It hates The Sun.
But there was nothing really that the BBC could say that the Sun had done wrong. There was no actual smoking guns, so to speak. They reported a story of people who were concerned about the BBC's behaviour, and particularly Newsnight, which decided that once this story had come out, they would go to town on Huw Edwards and start bringing up other allegations about him.
I perhaps differ with some of my colleagues in thinking that, you know, in the end, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And the fact of the matter is, as journalists, we do expose the abuse or misjudgments or misbehaviour of people in power, and if we do that to other people, and you know, one can think of lots of politicians or Jimmy Savile ultimately or others, then I think we have to be prepared to come under scrutiny ourselves if we have some degree of prominence and influence. And how those complaints are handled, I think, is constantly changing. But I think the Sun in this context was completely and utterly legitimate in what it did.
This was about whether the BBC was or wasn't investigating serious allegations made against its own staff. It was about basically a kind of cover-up culture that we've seen in several other organisations. So I do think that was legitimate public interest, and if it wasn't for the Sun doing these investigations, I'm not quite sure who else would be.
Now, those allegations that mother made, they were the first sign of that, the first breeze, if you will, of that forthcoming Force 10 gale that was going to envelop not just Huw Edwards, but the whole of the BBC. And it's a gale that's showing no signs of blowing out.
In the wake of the Sun's story, the BBC embarked on an investigation into internal complaints from staff about Huw Edwards, aired by its own Newsnight programme.
Newsnight has spoken to two other people, one a former BBC employee. This person told me they'd never met the newsreader, and this person said they received late-night messages on social media, including kisses from Huw Edwards, which they said they believed was an abuse of power.
The findings of that internal report remain secret.
We don't know who did the inquiry or is still doing the inquiry. What we do know is that the results of that BBC internal inquiry have not been published, and they should be.
Meanwhile, in February 2024, Anne and David received an apology from the BBC after a separate independent investigation ruled it had mishandled their original complaint.
After all we'd been through, it felt to us like it wasn't enough. We were expecting a letter of apology from Tim Davie. It just felt like it has done throughout all of this, like we have been brushed off.
2 months later, the BBC announced that Huw Edwards, who had been suspended on full pay, would be resigning on medical grounds.
So it seems to be that Huw Edwards was allowed to leave the BBC on his own terms, knowing, having a guilty mind, as he must have had, what he'd done. He has profited mightily by the prominence of his position at the BBC. He was a star. He was paid a star's salary.
What no one knew at the time, apart from a very small group of BBC bosses, including Director General Tim Davie and Head of News Deborah Turnis, was that 6 months earlier, Edwards had been arrested by police on suspicion of serious child sex offences. This man, Alex Williams, a 25-year-old from South Wales, had been convicted of sharing indecent images of children with a group of 5 paedophiles. One of those men was Huw Edwards. Williams, who trawled the dark web to access and distribute some of the most serious images of abuse, had been reaching out to celebrities online on WhatsApp and Telegram. Edwards was the only one to respond. The presenter chatted to the paedophile for 4 years, even meeting him once in person. Over that time, Edwards received 377 sexual images, of which 41 were indecent images of children. In exchange, Edwards would send hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds as gifts for the files, which he described as amazing. Williams used the money to support himself at university. Just over a year after the Sun's original story, Huw Edwards made a confession in court, admitting to receiving 41 indecent images, including 7 of the most serious type, Category A, of children as young as 7.
Former BBC news presenter Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty of making indecent images of children.
There was one time when my son said to me, "Do you think I'm the only one, Mum?" And I had to say, "No, love, there'll be others." But I was shocked when I heard the full extent of what he had admitted. When I heard that one of the children in his picture collection was a 7-year-old boy, I just cried and cried. It's so much worse than I thought. At the same time that man was grooming my son, he had these horrible pictures of children on his phone. No one will know what that has been like for me as a mother.
It was a strange reaction, actually. I felt sick at the charges. That day on the Monday when we got them confirmed, I literally couldn't believe it, that they were that serious. I'd obviously witnessed the pattern of behaviour and the grooming, and I knew what his modus operandi was, but I didn't know it was that bad. I think what was so shocking to everybody, and to people I know that worked with Huw Edwards as well, were really shocked that there were images of a boy as young as 7 to 9 years old in the most disturbing child abuse images that you can ever imagine.
There was clearly something about Huw Edwards which we, the public, the licence payer, did not know, which I suspect his own wife did not know, which I suspect his own children did not know. If, as we now know, he was accessing such pictures, well, we know he was accessing such pictures, then he is guilty of a really serious criminal offence. I don't think that anybody who admired Huw as a broadcaster, or indeed who was close to Huw in a family relationship, will be anything but absolutely appalled by that revelation.
Following Edwards' guilty plea, the Sun was approached by other men with stories of grooming and inappropriate messaging stretching back to at least 2018.
The enduring image, of course, from that service was that of Her Majesty the Queen, sitting alone as her husband of 73 years was laid to rest.
Whilst anchoring the official coverage of Prince Philip's funeral, Edwards pestered a junior BBC producer he was working with to come stay with him, despite COVID restrictions.
It started off friendly. I thought it'd be good to be in touch with him and potentially to meet him for career advice, and hoped he might give me some help. He even invited me to his hotel room at Prince Philip's funeral. I thought it was incredibly inappropriate and also against the COVID rules, which I was abiding by.
Every part of the United Kingdom is now in lockdown, with people being urged to stay at home as the scale of the public health emergency becomes even more daunting.
In January 2021, at the height of lockdown, Edwards breached COVID rules to meet a young man he'd been swapping messages with on social media, the same lockdown he reported on. On the day of the visit, he sent the youngster a present of £200, one of 3 similar payments made to a PayPal account.
Huw Edwards came round for an hour. I was quite shocked that he broke the rules to come meet me because of who he is. I was just a random person online. It was complete hypocrisy. He thought he was above everybody else. The BBC points the fingers at others who do wrong, but their big star was happy to act like the rules don't apply to him.
And several other young men came forward. One claimed that after meeting Edwards on a dating app, the presenter had tried to impress them with his celebrity connections.
Some friends of mine are going to share some wonderful things with you, starting with me and my friend Huw.
Sending pictures of himself with Sir Tom Jones and Mary Berry.
Have you got muscle? Huge muscles, just feel that now.
While another, just 17, alleged Edwards bombarded him on Instagram with love hearts and flowers.
When we were compiling our dossier, some of the evidence was shocking. Some of them, like an example, the idea that you can send a 16-year-old boy, 17-year-old boy, love heart messages, and that's appropriate, a stranger that you don't know, that just, those sorts of things shock me. But some of the stuff around the workplace that we had in our dossier was also extremely shocking, and not what you expect of somebody in such a position of power and trust. If a dossier like that had landed on my lap about the behaviour of one of my reporters, that person would have been fired. I think one of the problems that they've had over the years, and certainly it was the case with people like Edwards, that they're allowed to parade around the building as the all-powerful man, and people were too scared to make complaints about him, and some of those that did said they didn't get listened to. It created this culture that he was invincible. And so the fact that he's allowed to behave like that within the BBC is a culture, really. And I'd imagine, that was a similar culture going back to the Jimmy Savile days.
So it seems to be that Huw Edwards was allowed to leave the BBC on his own terms, knowing, having a guilty mind, as he must have had, what he'd done and what he was about to plead guilty to. Now that, to me, is a dereliction of duty, because you have to take hard decisions when you're at the top. Instead, the BBC put ahead of anything else the personal rights of Huw Edwards. They said they had a duty of care towards him, but he also had a duty of care to the BBC, not to bring them into disrepute, and quite clearly that was not just broken, it was shattered.
Amid the fallout of Edwards' court confession, BBC Chair Samir Shah told a House of Lords committee that the BBC has written to their former star presenter asking him to hand back £200,000 in salary paid after his arrest.
It was a shock to discover when it was announced, when he was charged, that he had led this double life. On the face of it, a trusted news presenter, but hidden secretly, he was this figure who did the most appalling things. I mean, let's not forget the victims of this, those are the children.
Well, I can tell you that Sun readers are furious about him keeping the money in his pension. So he kept his salary, he even got a pay rise, and then he gets the pension. Now, I'm sure legally it's very hard to take a pension away. But in terms of the fact that they kept paying the salary, that's what's really angered a lot of staff at the BBC and the wider public, for sure. Of course, Edwards should be paying the money back. It's what the public expect. But will he? I doubt it.
For Neil's stepfather, who blew the whistle on Edwards, the BBC has still failed them.
It's like we don't speak the same language. It's like they don't understand plain English, black and white. It's black and white in my book. I don't know what it is up in London. I don't know if black is blue or whatever, but the way they speak, the way they come about, it's like it doesn't make a difference. It must be normal. It must be normal everyday routines to them up there with the way they are. You know, they look at us. I think they look at us as if we're just lower class. That's it. We're just a lower class. And, you know, we're not educated and nothing like that. You don't have to be educated to know the difference between right and wrong. Do you know what I mean? It's there. It's there. It's simple. Our family's been destroyed, and it's been destroyed. It's been ruined, right the way from the top to the bottom. Grandparents, aunties, uncles, cousins, brothers, you know, sisters, everyone's been affected by it. It's ripped the family apart. I didn't want to see somebody else's family go through all this, but it had to. It had to happen, because the BBC didn't do nothing about it.
I believe the family have been treated unfairly. I think people are forgetting that this is a real family at the centre of this, with real emotions and real feelings, and this has broken up what was once a happy family. And I think that the way that people have responded to them coming out and speaking about the injustice of not having their complaint handled fairly, and for trying to help their son, has been absolutely heartbreaking. And I know that they have just done this for the greater good. They just have done this to save their son and save the mother. You know, they have had comments made at them, they've had stones thrown at their window, they've had people knocking on the door and running away. You know, people have said horrible things to them in the shop as they go to buy a pint of milk. It's been absolutely horrific for them, because people don't know what's happened here. They're reading stuff online. They're thinking that that they've done this in some way for financial gain or to to spite their son, and they haven't. And it's been horrible for them.
People in the street didn't believe us. We were called liars on social media by friends and colleagues of Huw Edwards. There were certain people who attacked us because they hated the Sun newspaper. We were in the eye of a storm. But everything we were saying was true. Now the whole world can see the kind of man he is. I knew he was an abuser, but now I know he's truly a monster. He should go to jail. Otherwise, he's not stopping. He's going to keep doing it. End of.
just heard the sentence. Huw Edwards has been given a 6 months jail suspended sentence for 2 years.
And this sentence also includes a sex offender treatment programme and 25 rehabilitation sessions.
On the 16th of September 2024, Huw Edwards escaped jail after the court heard the disgraced former presenter was in a perfect storm, suffering from a mix of mental disorders and problems with alcohol. The court also heard Edwards had a complex personality, brought on by his troubled relationship with his puritanical father. For Anne, the boy's mother, no punishment is enough for Edwards. Unable to confront the former presenter in person or in court, she's poured out her feelings in an open letter.
To Huw Edwards, I am writing this open letter to make you understand the immense pain and suffering you have caused me, my son, my family, your own family, and all of your victims over the years. You will receive your punishment in court. I won't be able to tell that court the full details of what you did to my family. But I hope, in writing this, to take back the power and control which you so cruelly stole from us. My son was a normal, happy teenager before you wormed your way into his life. When we tried to stop you, you tried to bribe us and set lawyers on us. Your friends in the media tried to smear us as liars. Our own family turned against us, even though everything we said was true. You drove a wedge between me and my son. Only now are we able to try to repair the damage you did. That you have lost everything is no consolation to us. All we care about is that we stopped your predatory grooming and saved our boy. For now, that is enough.
He is now being treated for serious mental health problems. But a week ago, Huw Edwards didn't know what was about to hit him and was talking to this Times journalist about his future.
I had no idea, no sense from that conversation that he was in any sort of trouble at all. And I'm pretty convinced that he didn't either have any inkling. This was why I was so astonished when his name came out over the weekend, not publicly, of course, but within journalistic circles, because it didn't add up. The man I just had lunch with was not the man being described in these allegations.
But it's emerged even before the Sun articles. BBC journalists had been looking into allegations against their own presenter, leading to Newsnight reporting allegations from BBC staff that Huw Edwards had abused his power, sending inappropriate messages.
Is it legitimate to investigate the private life of somebody with a high public profile? I mean, as late as last night, BBC Newsnight was running new allegations against Huw Edwards, even after the announcement that he was in hospital. So I don't think it's for broadcasters to necessarily point the finger at newspapers or vice versa. I think all of journalism has to ask itself some quite awkward questions.
Media organisations are always asking themselves not just what their audiences want to know, but what they have a right to know and what's private. Failures within a publicly funded organisation fall into the right to know category. But the behaviour of one of its top stars, well, that depends on the allegations.
The most significant journalist on the BBC and probably in the country, who was had one public image, which is of a happily married man with children with a strong church background. He was secretly associating with young people through dating websites.
But even if proven true, that's not what caused the storm. Questions for the Sun newspaper are, when it splashed this story on Saturday, had the alleged victim already told them it was untrue? The claims were repeated on Sunday, even though his lawyer says he denied it on Friday. What evidence did reporters have to back the parents' assertion that the presenter paid for explicit photos? And then publish the parents' claim the BBC had lied about their knowledge of this. The Sun printed other allegations, but now say it wasn't claiming criminality, but that their story was in the public interest.
If the young person before publication did deny that it happened, and they didn't reflect that in their article, then they wouldn't be able to, it's likely, rely on the public interest defence.
But The Sun's journalism has left the BBC investigating its highest profile newsreader and whether its own procedures helped cause this crisis. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Good evening. The unrelenting pressure.
Huw Edwards was, for many years, one of the BBC's most well-known newsreaders.
There are 650 MPs.
And a familiar face in homes across the UK.
Welcome to Windsor.
It's very difficult to overstate what a huge figure Huw Edwards was to the British viewing public.
Guiding the nation through some of the most significant events in recent history.
Reporting the death of Her Majesty the Queen.
But it was all to come crashing down. In front of the cameras for the wrong reasons.
He was extremely trusted as the voice of the nation. He abused that position.
His TV career over, ending up with a criminal conviction as a registered sex offender.
Even those close to him had one view of who Edwards was, which is very different. The one that's been revealed in this process.
Born in South Wales in 1961, Huw Edwards was brought up in a small village near Llanelli, landing his first broadcasting job at a commercial radio station, where he read bulletins in both English and Welsh. His first BBC job began in 1984 as a correspondent for BBC Wales. Where he also presented his first TV news bulletins. It was the beginning of his journey towards national fame.
3% nationwide in Wales of a victory for the Yes campaign.
I was very impressed by anybody who's bilingual. I thought he was modest and serious in his demeanour and a good political reporter.
He went on to present the BBC 6 o'clock news and eventually the news at 10, becoming a household name.
Tonight at 10, the latest evidence of ambulance services struggling to cope with rising demand. This will be the focus of more than 1 billion television viewers throughout the world.
And someone who talked the nation through some of the most crucial moments in recent history.
It's very difficult to overstate what a huge figure Huw Edwards was to the British viewing public. This was a man that most famously had announced the death of the Queen.
This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
He was the man that was there, that guided us through these moments of real national significance, and he was a fixture on our screens for many, many years.
But away from the spotlight, there was a private life which remained unseen, one which would eventually be out in the open, and the trusted newsreader became the story. In July 2023, a report by The Sun alleged that a high-profile BBC presenter had been involved in serious misconduct, but The Sun did not name Edwards.
Allegations tonight concerning a BBC presenter accused of paying a teenager for sexually explicit photographs beginning when they were 17. The claims in The Sun newspaper allege the unnamed male presenter paid the teenager tens of thousands of pounds.
The family of that young person said that they had been using that money, taking that money and using it to fund a drug habit.
A family came to us extremely concerned about their child, who was 17 at the time when the contact with Edwards first started. And their incredible frustration was that they'd been to complain to the BBC about Edwards' behaviour. They felt they were turned away, not listened to. They'd also spoken to the police, who were unhelpful, and they literally felt they had nowhere else left to go. Their child was taking Class A drugs and had so many issues around that, and they were concerned for his welfare. He'd been in and out of hospitals, and they just wanted the money to stop.
They say that they complained to the BBC about the presenter's behaviour in May, and the allegation is that the BBC didn't properly investigate it.
The parents gave us some evidence as well. We saw bank statements, we saw text messages, WhatsApps, MSN, all different kinds of messages. So we knew the story was true.
The Sun, I think, was very careful in what it did. It didn't identify the presenter, it didn't identify the gender of the person who had supposedly had some kind of improper contact with the presenter. And I have to say, it did not cross my mind at the time that the person involved could have been Huw.
Everybody wanted to know who it was. Now, we hadn't named him, and we hadn't named the young person at the heart of it. We didn't even say what gender they were, because we were mindful of both the young, I can now say, young boy's privacy and Edward's privacy.
The BBC announced they had suspended a male staff member and were working as quickly as possible to establish the facts. As the days passed, rumours spread, drawing in other BBC presenters.
Everyone in this building knows who it is. And there are an awful lot of people who you also have a duty of care to, male presenters on air, who are having to go on air to say that it's not them.
It is a very difficult and complex situation, and we're trying to calmly and judiciously navigate our way through quite difficult circumstances where, as I said, you've got to balance duty of care issues, privacy issues.
We had these very high-profile, famous individuals, the likes of Jeremy Vine, Gary Lineker, Nicky Campbell, all feeling obliged to state that they were not the individual at the heart of the allegations.
Jeremy Vine posted this on X. He said that the BBC presenter involved in the scandal should now come forward publicly, but that it was his decision and his alone. At the time, the young person themselves disputed the allegations, and detectives announced that there was no information to suggest a criminal offence had been committed.
The guns turned on us when the boy made his statement. Many people in the media used it as a stick to beat us with, but we had never once said that what had gone on between this boy and Edwards was criminal. There was a bit of a grey area, and we never said it was criminal. So that didn't surprise me that the police opened and shut that case.
The young man at the centre of the allegations would later go on to say that he felt groomed by Edwards. Soon after, Edwards' wife, Vicky Flynn, named her husband as the man at the centre of the media storm.
Tonight at 10, the news presenter Huw Edwards has been identified as the man at the centre of allegations over payments for sexually explicit images. A trusted face for millions, he's now in hospital receiving treatment for mental health issues.
Vicky Flynn issued this statement.
I am doing this primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children. Huw is suffering from serious mental health issues. As is well documented, he has been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He has suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care, where he'll stay for the foreseeable future.
If you are in a prominent position, if you are a public face, you can't say that the barrier for the bar for acceptable behaviour is that you've broken the law. I mean, a lot of people, not just in the media, but in corporate life and elsewhere, lose their jobs for behaviour well short of breaking the law.
Soon afterwards, BBC News, which report independently on the BBC, reported fresh allegations of Edwards' behaviour towards junior staff. A BBC employee has told us that they receive what they believe are inappropriate messages, that they'd received these messages on social media from the presenter.
So when other allegations emerged from the BBC about inappropriate conduct from Huw, particularly towards BBC members of staff, there was definitely fears that the BBC continued to fail to have a grip on its workplace culture and duty of care.
The BBC said it was continuing its own investigation. Then, in April 2024, the newsreader's career at the BBC officially came to an end.
The former presenter of this programme, Huw Edwards, has resigned from the BBC, saying he was leaving on the basis of medical advice from his doctors.
In the period he was suspended, he still received his salary of more than £435,000 a year. And then, in July 2024, the Metropolitan Police made a shocking announcement.
The former Former BBC presenter Huw Edwards has been charged with 3 counts of making indecent images of children.
I remember I came in here on a Monday morning and the news editor came running in saying we think Edwards has been charged, but what was even more of a shock was the nature of those charges. First, we had the name Huw Edwards, we checked on the court documents, we had to prove it was the same person, and when we saw the detail of those charges, I was staggered.
Making an indecent image is effectively the creation of an indecent image of a child. This also extends further in terms of the accessing, viewing, sharing and distribution of such images. Every time that image is viewed, circulated and distributed again and again and again, leads to re-victimise that child and continue that level of abuse.
Some of the charges involved Category A images.
They can be categorised into A, B and C, with A being the most serious images, the most severe images, which involve sexual penetrative activity.
In July 2024, Edwards appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court.
The seriousness of the crimes that the Met announced were shocking in the extreme and really, really surprised a lot of people in the industry.
Huw Edwards pleaded guilty.
Good evening. The former BBC News presenter Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty to accessing indecent images of children as young as 7 after he was sent hundreds of sexual images on WhatsApp by a man he met online. Westminster Magistrates Court was told that 41 of them were indecent images of children.
He obviously knew that there was evidence there, so I think he almost certainly did the sensible thing. He's clearly spared himself the possibility of a drawn-out and embarrassing trial, which I would have thought that nobody, either his former employers or he, would have wanted.
It emerged that he had been arrested in November 2023, 7 months before, after police discovered his involvement in a WhatsApp chat with a man called Alex Williams dating back to 2020. Williams started to send the BBC staff photos and videos. Over 16 months, Edwards was sent 377 images, including illegal ones. The court heard the former newsreader kept on messaging Williams, even when Williams sent him underage pictures and Edwards had asked him to stop. His lawyer said there was no suggestion Edwards had created any images or sent them to anyone.
Newsnight can reveal that the BBC knew back in November that the investigation into one of their highest paid talents related to child abuse images, and they still paid him his salary.
When it realised its star presenter had been arrested, should he have been sacked? Because between the point where he was arrested and his resignation, he was paid more than £200,000, public money, a salary which increased by £40,000 last year.
Why also did they let him leave on his own terms? If you remember, he resigned from the BBC in April. He said on the medical advice of doctors. The BBC certainly didn't give him a fulsome send-off. Clearly, the BBC was trying to balance its duties as an employer of Huw Edwards, those duties of care that they have. But now that we know these facts, the decision does look reputationally very difficult for the BBC.
The BBC's David Sillitoe interviewed Director General Tim Davie.
Yesterday, the BBC said it was shocked, but you knew about this in November of last year when Huw Edwards was arrested. You knew it related to child abuse, and you didn't sack him. Why?
Well, we were very shocked, and that's the first thing I want to say, which is no one knew about the specifics of what we heard over the last few days, which has been deeply disturbing. Now, when it comes to the decision that we made in November, when we were obviously faced with, I think, a very difficult decision, actually, and we considered it very carefully. The police came to us and gave us information that they had arrested Mr. Edwards, but they wanted to be assured of total confidence. And the reason they rang us at that point was to ensure that, and it's a technical process, which is to ensure employees are protected.
You're worried about the welfare of Huw Edwards. What about the welfare of the children?
Well, we're absolutely, the primary thoughts here are always for victims of these terrible situations.
So why not just sack him?
Because, quite simply, the police came to us and said, look, we need to do our work in total confidence.
It would have been still confidential and you could have sacked him.
I think you're then into a different argument, which is it fair to sack someone, and is the right action at that?
You had a raft of complaints about him. You had the Sun story, and you had this.
When the police, and I put, if you think about this in terms of precedent, people do get arrested, and then we've had situations where no charges and there's nothing there to be followed up on. In this case, we knew it was serious. We knew no specifics, by the way.
I think one can understand the BBC management doing that from the point of view of managers, but one can also understand that it looks incredibly awkward to the general public once you know someone's facing very serious charges to go on paying them. So I think that was probably a mistake, although I fully accept that there might have been quite complex legal advice around going ahead with it.
The BBC asked Edwards to hand back the £200,000 he had earned since he was suspended. In September 2024, Huw Edwards appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court for sentencing.
The court's been hearing that Huw Edwards paid another man, Alex Williams, hundreds of pounds for gifts and presents in exchange for these images. We also heard the prosecution talking through some of the exchanges on the WhatsApp messages that were shared between Edwards and Williams.
The prosecutor said that Williams offered to send naughty and young images, to which Edwards replied, "Go on." Edwards had also described some of the indecent images as amazing. In his sentencing remarks, Chief Magistrate Paul Goldspring noted that Edwards had no previous convictions, had voluntarily stopped receiving the images, had shown remorse, and had a mental disorder. He was sentenced to a 6-month jail sentence, suspended for 2 years, and was placed on the sex offenders register for 7 years. The BBC released a statement saying, "We are appalled by his crimes. He has betrayed not just the BBC, but audiences who put their trust in him."
It's a very tragic downfall at the end of the day for an individual who was one of the most famous, if not most liked, individuals in the country.
Obviously the nature of the complaints that we had were slightly different to and less horrific than the ones that he's actually been found guilty of. But clearly we established, with our original story, helped establish a pattern of behaviour. I think he's a predator and an abuser, and he was using his power and influence and trust.
It appears that his living separately from his wife and children now, even those close to him had one view of who Huw Edwards was, which is very different from the one that's been revealed in this process.
This is not a victimless crime. Behind every image is a vulnerable child that has been exploited and has been abused.
If you have been affected by some of the issues raised in this film, details of help and support are available at bbc.co.uk/actionline.
From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. On Wednesday this week, my colleague was outside Westminster Magistrates Court on a hot summer's day to watch a media scrum like no other.
Well, it was incredibly busy. There were lawyers in the queue for other cases complaining about how long the queue was and how busy it was. Unsurprisingly, there were protesters protesting essentially against the BBC and saying that they were allowing paedophiles to get away with it. I mean, it was pretty extreme stuff.
Mr. Edwards, Dr. Paedophile at the BBC. We're calling on Tim Davies to reform the organisation.
And there was Huw wearing sunglasses. It's funny because some of the commentary around this has said that he sort of looked like destroyed by what's happened to him recently. And that wasn't the impression I got. Of course, it's only an impression. But One of the things I found very strange once we were in the court, and obviously he's behind a glass box, you know, the journalists are sort of tucked away at the back, so you don't get necessarily a very good view. But I thought he looked exactly the same Huw that we saw, you know, delivering the Queen's death to the nation, telling the nation that had happened. The even more odd thing was hearing his voice, the same voice that you know so well, delivering the news, delivering all these sort of state occasions, and then there he was pleading guilty, and that was quite sort of shocking to hear, really, because it's that same famous, actually very beautiful voice, Welsh accent, you know, all those lovely things about it, and then talking about the darkest thing that anyone could admit to. I actually found it quite hard to listen to the allegations, to be honest.
The nation's biggest newsreader, one of the BBC's biggest stars, is now a convicted paedophile. But many questions remain. The story today, the fall of Huw Edwards.
I'm Rosamund Irwin, the media editor of the Sunday Times.
Let's get into the charges then that were talked through by the prosecution in the courtroom that he was pleading guilty to. What were the charges?
So he'd been being sent images on a WhatsApp conversation by another man who we now know is a convicted paedophile. So he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of making indecent images of children. It's 41 images in total, 7 of which are what's considered the most extreme category A. Sorry to say this out loud because it's very unpleasant, but you can involve penetration of a child or something else of that sort of very extreme nature. 2 of these images were involving very clearly underage children, so estimated to be aged between 7 and 9. Of course, they don't know necessarily who these individuals are.
So he was sent these photographs, but also they were discussed in the WhatsApp chat as well.
And there is there is obviously the barrister on his side presents some mitigating factors, and one of them is the fact that Huw did say that he didn't want footage of children who were underage, i.e. that it was illegal.
The words used, don't send me illegal things.
Yes,
but this was after
correct.
He had received some of this category A material,
yes.
And that had been discussed.
Yes, and to be clear, there were plenty of other images that had crossed a line. So it was only, I believe, according to what was said in court, he's only said that once, to be clear. So it wasn't as though they said he'd repeatedly said, I do not want this.
Huw Edwards was charged with making photos and videos, but legally, the thing we need to be clear about is making doesn't necessarily mean producing. His barrister in the court on Wednesday said, quote, "There's no suggestion in this case that Mr. Edwards has, in the traditional sense of the word, created any image of any sort." He also added that he did not keep any images, did not send them to anyone else, and has not sought similar images from anywhere else. And Rosa, in all the different strands of this, we should be clear, what we were talking about out of Westminster Magistrates Court is separate to the story that The Sun reported on last year. This was a mother's claims that a BBC presenter, later we realised was Huw Edwards, paid their child tens of thousands of pounds and received explicit photos over 3 years, beginning when they were 17. And that young person is not involved with what we heard out of court.
Yes, the Met has actually confirmed that, and they did not find any criminality in the original case.
So that was Wednesday in court.
Yeah.
He's going to be back in court in September.
Mid-September, yeah.
For sentencing.
Yes.
What are we expecting from that?
The person who sent him the images, we know, has had a suspended sentence. But theoretically, you could go to prison for up to 10 years for this.
The person who sent these images on the chat to Huw Edwards, tell me a bit about that person.
He's a 25-year-old man called Alex Williams, and this is actually how this case has come out. It hasn't come out as a result of the original investigation, which was stemmed from the work done by the Sun newspaper. It's separate to that. What happened was the South Wales police got in touch with the Metropolitan Police because they had this separate investigation that obviously must have included this man, Alex Williams. And obviously they could see on this in these WhatsApp groups who was receiving these images, and clearly one of those people was Huw Edwards.
You were saying about how when you were in court and he was actually pleading guilty to these charges, you had this incongruous feeling, I guess, about here's this man who was so used to delivering the most important news to the biggest possible audience, and has been doing for 20 years, but then here he is in the centre of all this darkness and grim news. Now you've had a bit of time to let that percolate. I mean, you've met him in the past. You've reported on this world. How does this add up in your mind, this man, and he was able to do this?
Well, I think it's very hard for a lot of us to understand how anyone can do that. And, originally, when the original Sun story broke, there were a number of people who came out to defend Huw Edwards. Now, obviously, they weren't aware of this, and people do defend their friends. But the point that I've repeatedly come back to on this story is, even if what he had originally done wasn't criminal, it was unprofessional. And in your contract at the BBC or at the Sunday Times, you have something that says you mustn't bring the organisation into disrepute. So the difficulty, I think, even in relation to that young person, that behaviour can be inappropriate. And even if it's not criminal, it can be something that an organisation should be saying is so inappropriate that you should no longer be representing them or working for them. And I think that's been sort of under talked about in the coverage. And of course, the BBC then becomes aware that he has been arrested in November 2023. And at that point, it isn't just that they know he's been arrested for a serious offence. They also have everything else that they know about him.
Which includes what? Because we should go through that, because ever since that first Sun story broke, things that had existed as gossip in the past actually did start to surface as actual allegations from people outside and within the BBC saying what he did wasn't necessarily criminal or even, harassment, but just made them feel uncomfortable and they didn't like.
Yeah, and we've all got to think, when we're contacting fellow members of staff, we have to think about whether there's a power dynamic in there. Now, I'm not an immensely powerful person, but he is at the BBC, he was at the BBC, a very powerful person. And if you had him, as we know happened, messaging you, of course, you're not going to feel free to react to that in a way that you might if it was, say, somebody, that you met in a club saying something you didn't like. And so that messaging in itself, while yes, it may not even be enough to get you sacked, it should be enough to get you a warning. You're making other members of staff feel uncomfortable. But also, there was a complaint made about Huw Edwards from a woman, a member of the public, nothing to do with the BBC, about 2 years before the allegations that saw him taken off air. Now, that complaint got retracted after Mr. Edwards had contacted her. And then, again, she made a second complaint in 2022. So she'd made 2 complaints. And with that, she'd passed a body of evidence to the BBC. And they had on both occasions warned him 2 things, to think about his social media use, which there are very strict guidelines at the BBC. And on top of that, they'd said to him to cease contact with this woman, which obviously he restarted. So we know he had been warned by the BBC, by his managers.
Which brings us back then to, I guess, what the questions outstanding are for the BBC, because as you mentioned there, we now know that they knew that he'd been arrested in November. So there's a question over what they did with Huw Edwards after that point, but also what they had done or didn't do with Huw Edwards in the years previously, when, as discussed, some people said, oh, he's just sent me this message that I don't really find is, suggestive and a bit has made me feel uncomfortable. So on both of those things, what do you think the BBC needs to do or reveal?
Well, there's a big question of, as someone put it to me, and there's always a gallows humour about really dark stories. I should say this. They said it's Huw knew what when. And there is a question of that, isn't there? Because lots of people within the BBC are saying there was an awareness of him making people feel uncomfortable, and that there had been that awareness for a long time.
So if we know from that case that you just mentioned that senior managers at one point had, spoken to him about contact that he'd had with people, we now know post that the stories that were in the Sun that there were people within the BBC who said that he'd sent the messages that which made them feel uncomfortable. We know that they then did some kind of internal investigation into that. Who knows where that has gone?
Well,
so question 1 for the BBC is, where is that? What did you find out?
Well, they're not going to publish it because he left the BBC. That was the original sort of answer on that, is that report is going to go unpublished because he's no longer a BBC staff member. Well, they let him leave on his own terms. They kept him on staff from November, once they knew he'd been arrested. And then they let him go on his own terms in April. Now, there was a very sort of terse statement out of the BBC in April. It did say he has decided to resign on health grounds. Now, why the BBC did not think that allowing him to go on his own terms in this situation wasn't itself problematic, given that he'd been arrested. Now, they said they were waiting for a charge, but when he was arrested, you already had a body of evidence of complaints, and I don't understand why the arrest isn't the straw that breaks the camel's back here. And instead, they have allowed him to stay on being paid his enormous salary until April.
The BBC kept paying his £479,000 a year's salary until he resigned in April. You know, they paid him more than £200,000 following his arrest. So
I'm not a lawyer, but I have spoken to a lawyer on this, and they say you can't get back that salary. He didn't get a payoff. I think that's. But how on earth would he have been entitled to a payoff? He'd been being paid when he hadn't been on air for, by that stage, about 9 months.
But turning the clock back, they could have sacked him at the point of arrest. You could say, we've had all this stuff in the past with you. We've now got this arrest. That we think is grounds to be able to sack you.
I think there certainly is an argument there. It's not for me, to decide that, but I think this is licence fee payers' money ultimately. So I do think the public has a say on this in a way they might not in other organisations, and I think for a lot of people that's going to sit very uncomfortably. I mean, one of the classic things that you learn as covering media about how the BBC handles crisis is they just don't get a grip on things. They let them drag on and drag on. So I think they should really think about how they handle crises, because ultimately the buck stops with the Director General, Tim Davie, and he's going to have questions to answer. And we know that the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, we're recording this on Thursday, is set to meet Tim Davie later.
And for their part, we've heard from Tim Davie in the past on the fact that Huw Edwards was still being paid for this period. He said no one wants to waste a pound, but we do need to act proportionally and fairly, and I think that's what we did, he said. And of course, the BBC put out a sort of lengthy statement on Wednesday where they said they were shocked to hear the details that emerged in court. There can be no place for such abhorrent behaviour. In November 2023, whilst Mr Edwards was suspended, the BBC, as his employer at the time, was made aware in confidence that he had been arrested on suspicion of serious offences, they say, and that he was released on bail. At the time, they said no charges had been brought against Mr Edwards, and the BBC had also been made aware of significant risks to his health. Taking all of that into account, though, what do you think the risk is here for senior managers in the BBC? The most senior manager in the BBC, maybe Tim Davie.
I think Tim Davie's in a very difficult position over this. It's usually on the news side where the crisis gets rid of the Director General.
But there was George Entwistle who went over the news nights, hoo-ha, and there was Greg Dyke who went over the
weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
I feel like Tim Davie is very good at clinging on, though. He's had a very tricky run of, we had the Martin Bashir scandal. We've now got all the problems around Strictly Come Dancing. At the moment, the BBC, its most popular entertainment show, the sort of flagship show, the one it's selling around the world, that is embroiled in a terrible crisis about the treatment of celebrities on that show. I should say this isn't the only scandal they've got going. They've had the Tim Westwood investigation, which has cost them a huge amount of money. They've got an investigation into Russell Brand, who worked for the BBC between 2006 and 2008. So it's not as though this is their only problem, but I think because it's a news problem, it's closer to Tim.
Ros, just finally, there was a sense after all of this Huw Edwards stuff started with that those allegations in The Sun and then all that followed, but there was a sense out of the BBC that there needed to be a reckoning with how they deal with big stars and the power and influence that they wield over the people they work with, and maybe how they're treated differently. Do you think we will see progress on that? Do you think it's ever possible to fix that quite complicated dynamic where you have a star on hundreds of thousands of pounds who's on people's TVs every evening and has been for 20 years, working, a desk away from somebody who's on 28 grand and is, in their early 20s?
So I think they really need to stop sort of having this sort of weird class of sort of untouchables, of people who, who are invincible, who are indulged. We are all replaceable ultimately in our jobs, unless you have some really niche skill. And it isn't saving lives. It isn't difficult surgery or complex medical cases. And I don't want to do down journalism. I'm a massive believer in its power. But we shouldn't talk about these people as though they're sort of gods, sort of god tier of journalists. That isn't the case. So that's the first thing. And then I think within that, they need to do more to encourage people who feel uncomfortable, even if it is just that low level, to be able to feel as though they'll be listened to if they come forward. They have done some work around that, and the policies have changed and they've got new initiatives. But I think they need to sort of pop the bubble of people's egos a bit.
So we've heard from Ros Irwin, media editor at the Sunday Times, on the scandal and the lingering questions for the BBC. But if we cycle backwards, was Huw Edwards actually anything like the image that he projected on screen? Well, on a warm July day, almost exactly a year ago, at a swish hotel in central London, another colleague of mine, feature writer at the Times, Andrew Billen, went to go and see Edwards, who at that point was riding high. His career was peaking.
We'd gone for lunch in a fashionable restaurant, the Wolsey in Piccadilly in London, and we drank a little bit. He was just back from Edinburgh, where he'd been presenting a special News at 10 on a royal occasion, where the King was given the keys and the crown jewels of Scotland. And he was in good spirits. This was the second long lunch and fourth or fifth occasion that I'd met Huw. We gossiped, really. He mainly gossiped to me about the BBC, what was right, what was wrong, and specifically his career at the BBC and how long he was going to stay there.
And what did he say about what his future might be there? I mean, what were his hopes for what the year ahead would be like?
The background was that the last time I'd had lunch with him, which was like a year before, he had been clearly unhappy that he wasn't being used enough or prominently enough. And he was wondering if his time as anchor of the BBC News at 10 after 20 years might be coming to an end. On this occasion, he was more self-confident. It's funny to talk about self-confidence in a man who had such authority on television, but he was niggled by worries, paranoid almost. He was slightly happier because he'd had, and this sounds bad to say as well, but he'd had a good Queen's death. He'd announced the news that Her Majesty had died to the nation. He had then presented much of the funeral coverage, and he was widely praised for that. And at the end of that second lunch, we left the restaurant, we shook hands. I said I wished he would let me pay for lunch one of these days. And he went off to see his tie maker. And I got the train home to Oxford. And of course, I had no idea. And I am convinced he had no idea what was going to follow. And what was going to follow was going to be the end of his career. And in many ways, the end of his life. Because after we said goodbye, it could only have been hours, maybe 12 hours at most, before he got the call from the BBC saying there had been inquiries from the Sun about his personal life. And at that moment, he must have known everything was over.
This was a mother's claims that a BBC presenter had paid their child tens of thousands of pounds and received explicit photos of them over 3 years, beginning when they were 17. What did you think when that first allegation and story broke out there and you realised it was him?
Well, at the end of that quite long lunch, we said goodbye in Piccadilly, and we'd both enjoyed the lunch. He talked, as he always did, about his family quite a bit, how proud he was of his children, what they were doing, and always spoke of his wife, Vicky, in warm terms, and how he relied on her advice. So that was Thursday, about 5 o'clock, I suppose. On Friday, the rumours started about a BBC presenter being the centre of allegations. And on that night, he didn't appear on the BBC One show which he'd been due to appear on. And then on Saturday, a journalist friend of my wife said, Andrew knows Huw Edwards, doesn't he? Is he the guy at the centre of all this? And I just laughed. He said, absolutely not. I saw he hadn't got a care in the world when I saw him on Thursday by Huw Edwards standards. And then I was told on Monday or Tuesday, it was Huw Edwards. And I was shocked in two ways. I was shocked that he could be in such trouble. And I was also shocked that somebody who's been interviewing people for decades and likes to think he is some sort of judge of character, could have read him so wrong.
And you said this was the second lunch you'd had with him. Is he the kind of person that you saw on any other occasion? I mean, had you interviewed him in the past?
Yes, I had interviewed him in 2020 during the summer of that first lockdown. We actually met in a cemetery in South London near his home. At that stage, he didn't talk to the press very much. But on this occasion, he opened up quite fully. He was really frank about what a treacherous place the BBC could be, how he had to fight for his position, how he felt an outsider. We joked, because we were in a cemetery, that he knew where all the bodies were buried. And he was willing to tell me about some of the bodies of the BBC that were buried as well. And it was a very amicable interview. He was very reflective, and he talked about the death of his father and how it had plunged him into depression, and how he'd got out of that, mainly through exercise and losing weight and taking up amateur boxing.
Yes.
And we left on very good terms, very warmly. And I was about to go on a holiday after I'd filed the piece, and I was relieved that he bothered to text me while I was away to say that he'd liked the piece, although I had misdescribed his trousers as dogtooth, and apparently there was something slightly different about the pattern.
Okay. Oddly, and this sort of slightly pales in comparison as a misdemeanor, now we know a lot more about him and what he has done. But at the end of your first lunch, he drank quite a lot, it seems, on shift, which is so incredibly reckless, and it seems like a very interesting personality point that he would do that in front of a journalist, even if it was off the record.
There was a recklessness about that lunch. He kept ordering glasses of champagne. We met at 2:00, and at 5:00 I said, Huw, I think I'll have an espresso rather than another glass of champagne. And Huw called over the waiter and said, I'd like a glass of champagne, and my friend would like an espresso and a glass of champagne. So we still had another glass of champagne. We must have got through between us a bottle each of champagne. And at 6:00 he said, well, I'd better be going now because I've got to present the 10 tonight. We were at a restaurant just across the road from New Broadcasting House. And I said, God, you're presenting tonight, are you? And he said, don't worry, I'll have 3 pints of water and 3 espressos, and I'll be absolutely fine. And when I got home and I watched the BBC News at 10 that night, he was absolutely fine. So to that extent, he was a professional, but a reckless man at the same time.
Shall we rewind through his story? Where did he grow up? I mean, he's famously a Welshman, but whereabouts?
Yes, he was born in Bridgend in South Wales, and then moved west a few miles to a place quite near Llanelli, where he grew up the son of a very academic father and a kind of home-loving mother. I think it was a happy childhood. He said he didn't see his father as much as he perhaps would have wanted to. They were a chapel-going family, and in fact, in later life, Huw Edwards in London founded a Welsh Presbyterian church where he played the organ. And from there, he went to Cardiff University, having failed to get into Oxbridge, which infuriated him because he was a very talented linguist. And after Cardiff, I think he probably toyed with an academic career. After all that, he decided to go into broadcasting and soon found himself at the BBC in Wales, where he was actually covering the miners' strike of 1984, which he said it was quite hard for him to maintain his independence on that because he came from a family of miners. But he did all that. He was highly rated. He was told by some head of BBC News in Wales that he would never make national broadcasting, which of course only made him more certain that he wanted to do that.
His main job in the end was presenting the 10 o'clock news, and he started doing that in 2003, so just over 20 years ago now. And it can't really be overstated how, because of the longevity and the profile and the position and the stories he covered, he was sort of more than a celebrity, more than your everyday newsreader in terms of where he sits or sat in the public consciousness.
Yes, there's a strong argument that Britain doesn't really have anchormen in the way that America has, i.e. a news presenter who's with the nation every night and then does the elections and the funerals and the breaking stories. But Huw really was that man. If it was a really big story, you knew it was a really big story because Huw Edwards would be presenting it.
America is pounded in the world's biggest terrorist attack. The voters decide that after 4 decades, it's time for Britain to leave the European Union. Swordbearer today, it's the first time that a woman has fulfilled this role in the coronation service.
So he would do royal weddings. He would do the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh. He announced to the nation that the Queen had died.
This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. In a statement, the palace said the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon.
He took us all the way through COVID. The ratings for the BBC News at 10 were as big as they'd ever been because we're all trapped at home. And I certainly, and my wife, we watched him every night. It was grim viewing. But one thing we did think is that if you told it to us, it was probably right.
All 4 nations of the United Kingdom are trying to agree on a common approach to the Christmas period and the restrictions that might be needed during that time.
But one of the absurdities of the way television works is that when Laura Koenigsberg did a series on recent politics, they needed a clip of the BBC's coverage of the 2019 election. And they didn't use any clip of Huw Edwards, but kind of mocked it up to look as if Laura Koenigsberg were presenting the programme rather than him. He'd been airbrushed out of history. So the BBC archive department has a huge problem now because on the big moments of recent history, Huw Edwards was the man telling the nation what that history was. And now it seems they can't use his face. We can't hear his voice. He's become an unperson.
And how do you feel now then, I guess, knowing the fact that he is now a convicted paedophile?
I'm absolutely horrified. I wrote to him months and months after he was suspended from the BBC. We had a chat about maybe going for a walk together one weekend in Wales and possibly write a piece about this. So I just said, hi Huw, I'm sorry if this is inappropriate, I apologise, but if you'd still like to go for that walk, completely off the record, I'd be on for it, because I thought he would be feeling very isolated. But this is such a heinous development. It's one of the greatest moral crimes you can commit in our society right now. And I think our society has probably got it right about taking it very, very seriously. So I won't be writing to him again, I'm afraid.
Andrew Billen, feature writer at The Times. And we also heard earlier from Rosamund Irwin, who is media editor at The Sunday Times. There is plenty more from them and their colleagues on this story. More reporting, more analysis at thetimes.com if you have a subscription. The producers today were Olivia Case and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Fiona Leach. Sound design was by James Shield, and the theme was written by Mal Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.